I recently watched a video from Pufferfish Creations about the difference between dark and edgy, and I've been seeing this discussion make its rounds lately, so I figured I'd put my hat in the ring. But before I get into my take on it, feel free to check out their channel. At the time of writing this, they have yet to reach 3,000 subscribers, and I'd really like to send some of you guys their way. And if they happen to come watch this video, hello! I hope you like my take on it. Anyways, the first thing I wanted to discuss was a bit of a critique for that video. Now, I am in no position to judge other people for clickbait titles and thumbnails, but one thing I noticed about this video is that it doesn't really accomplish its goal of defining the two terms dark and edgy. Yes, many things in writing and art are subjective, and what one person might find dark, another person might find edgy. However, I also think that just because people misuse or misunderstand the terms they use, that does not mean that the terms must change or that we cannot arrive at a solid definition. What one person defines as dark or edgy might be completely different from another person's definition, but that doesn't mean there isn't some sort of intersectionality between our collective definitions. For example, one person might define the term edgy to mean someone who is rebellious against an unfair society or set of laws, someone who goes against social norms, but who will technically be considered the narrative protagonist. Meanwhile, other people might use the term edgy to mean someone or something who is so unrealistically dark and depressing that it borders on comedy. On the other end, some people might define the term dark to mean anything and everything which is depressing or unsettling. However, this technically encapsulates the term edgy as well, doesn't it? Some might try to distinguish something dark from something edgy by saying that a dark story is dark because it has something of substance beyond the typical shock factor of something that's edgy. Something dark is profound and intellectually satisfying, whereas something edgy is trying too hard and has no appeal outside of its shocking content. Now, these types of things are all valid arguments, but that doesn't necessarily make them true. If you've been watching this channel for a little while now, you will know that I tend to distinguish between things which are valid arguments and things which are true. I think it's completely valid to have the perspective that dark and edgy is simply a blurred line with a lot of subjectivity to it. There might even be some truth to the claim. But overall, the claim itself, I think, is not true. Typically, when we refer to something which is dark, we take it under a positive connotation, whereas things which are referred to as edgy are often used in a negative way. Now, that's not to say that people cannot enjoy edgy things. After all, people can enjoy bad movies for reasons beyond their intended purpose. And I myself am a person who enjoys most horror movies, not because they scare me, but because they make me laugh. If in this video I were to go ahead and say the difference between edgy and dark is subjective, and everyone has their own definition, so it doesn't really matter in the end, I think that would be ignoring the fact that someone can create something which is intentionally edgy or intentionally dark, and then have other people pick up on that. I would also argue that the two terms are not mutually exclusive, and they often have a lot of intersectionality, but they are still distinguishable. And just because you can find both elements in a single piece of fiction, that does not mean that those elements are incapable of being separated. You can have edginess in a dark story, and you can have dark moments in an edgy story. These two terms, while they are not interchangeable, are also not terms which necessarily remark upon the quality of what is written. So in my view, any definitions which refer to something edgy as something which is bad, and something dark as something which is good, are less of true definitions and more of valid tastes in media being portrayed by the person critiquing. Perhaps we collectively enjoy dark things more than we enjoy edgy things, but that does not mean an edgy story is poorly written. After all, edgy things appeal to people as well, and not always in the way that bad movies or bad writing might appeal to somebody. These terms are often misused by people to describe a gradient of quality in a piece of fiction, but in actuality, they're not a descriptor of a story's quality at all. In my opinion, the terms dark or edgy are actually more of a measure of an audience's expectation, perspective, and preference. Here's what I mean. When we use the terms dark or edgy, we are never describing any one particular type of act or storytelling device. One man's dark is another man's edgy. In fact, I don't think writers are often concerned with the difference between these two things. Oftentimes, we as viewers will use these terms in a way to describe something we've watched to somebody else. They are words with which we attempt to set expectations for other people who may not have watched or read what we have. But at the end of the day, what do we mean by these terms, and how can we use this to make our writing better? Additionally, how can we use both of these expectations to engage an audience who is looking for those expectations to be fulfilled by your story? When we use the term dark, we often mean something which unsettles us on a more intellectual level. Something which gets us to think about the implications of what we've seen, and process those emotions in a logical way. We see this with BoJack Horseman, which Pufferfish Studios also uses as an example of something which is more dark than edgy. The majority of the dark situations in BoJack are a result of the human emotions, intelligence, and logic, or rather the flawed logic, of the characters in the show. The show reveals a piece of ourselves, the person who struggles to change, the person who struggles to do better, the person who has not been given a fair life but who should also not be excused for all the bad shit they've done. If you lack either the perspective of BoJack Horseman or the empathy for that perspective, however, you might end up calling BoJack Horseman edgy for how he's never allowed to be forgiven for all of his mistakes. And we might say that a person who calls BoJack Horseman edgy is just missing the point of the show. We might even call them media illiterate, or just a brainless idiot. However, that is their subjective opinion on the show, even if we feel they might misunderstand or misuse the terms. That's the point of this video. Some people are just confidently wrong about this subject, but because most people don't have a solid grasp on the subject, we end up muddying these terms to mean things they do not. The truth about what distinguishes something dark from something edgy is that it is often the difference between whether your audience can relate to your story on an emotional and logical level, or if they are disconnected from the terrible situations you present to them. One of the key differences between dark and edgy is the ways in which we process them, where both are emotionally stimulating or unsettling to us. Something dark incentivizes us to react to our emotions intellectually. We are incentivized to make sense of things because we're not given a solid answer from the story itself. Something edgy, on the other hand, will often have a statement or conclusion, and we will have no choice but to react emotionally to it. Something dark can make us more immersed and engage with it on a thoughtful level, whereas something edgy can sometimes either make us more immersed and engaged, or it can make us reject the conclusion that it makes. In other words, something we find to be edgy can take us out of our immersion. I think this is where the misconception of edgy being bad writing comes from. Many of us think that it's only good writing when our audience is able to connect and resonate with our story. However, as I mentioned before, there are people out there who crave that type of disconnect. Some people don't want to have their psyches dragged through all the dark, gritty implications of something that goes on in your story. Some people, like myself, watch horror movies to laugh. There are many people who love power fantasies and hate the idea of introducing gritty realism into a genre where it's neither the appeal nor the point. When we see Superman knock out a bunch of bad guys, none of us are thinking, man, that guy who was unconscious for 2 hours probably has a concussion. He might have hit his head on the concrete and ended up paralyzed, or worse, dead. Superman is a man of steel in a paper world after all. Oh, the horror. There's no way he should be able to hold back the correct amount all the time. Instead of thinking stuff like that, we're thinking, wow, that's so cool that he just beat up a bunch of bad guys and saved the day. And yet some people would prefer a story like Invincible over a story like Superman. Or they might even prefer, while sporting a massive chip on their shoulder, a show like The Boys over a show like Superman. And I think Invincible and The Boys presents a fantastic example of this dichotomy between a story which is dark and a story which is edgy. In my opinion, Invincible is a dark story, where The Boys is an edgy story. And if we're using my previous definitions on these two terms, we'll find that they fit rather well. Invincible does not ever seem to plant its flag in the ground and make a statement or conclusion about a superhero-type world. it merely depicts its world in a more realistic and gritty way. Superheroes don't have plot armor. Sometimes the superhero ends up hurting someone they're trying to save by complete accident because they're not in full control of their powers yet. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking the most punishing path. And yet, there is an overall positive outlook in the story despite all of the dark themes and situations. There are still good things to be seen in the story despite its darkness. There are moments of hope, heroism, and triumph. There are moments of brevity and normalcy. There's not really a statement being made, it's just a depiction of a world where superheroes have less plot armor. Invincible asks the question, what if superheroes were more realistic? And then decides to tell the story where superheroes are treated more realistically. Sometimes they don't save the day, sometimes they're hopelessly outmatched, sometimes they die and they don't come back, and sometimes all of the fucked up shit they see starts to get to them. But it never makes a conclusion. Rather, it allows the audience to come to whatever conclusion they like about it. On top of that, whatever Invincible presents to us is rarely, if ever, cynical. The Boys, on the other hand, is an incredibly cynical take on the superhero genre, and it would not be unreasonable to call it edgy. Once again, just because something is cynically written or edgy, that doesn't mean that it's poorly written. The Boys and Invincible have the same general starting point. What if superheroes were more realistic? What if Superman was not an incorruptible and unbeatable beacon of hope? What if Superman did not always use his powers for good? The Boys is a story which comes to the conclusion that if Superman actually existed, he'd be an unchecked bully. And if superheroes actually existed, they would also all pretty much be vain, self-serving assholes who abuse their powers behind the scenes and use it as a way to act superior to those who don't have powers. Where Invincible does not make a hard statement as to whether or not superpowers and superheroes are bad or good, or that the society as a whole is bad or good, The Boys generally tells us that society and superpowers are bad because people are generally bad if you give them the chance to be. The Boys goes against the notion that if the real world ever gained superpowers, we would all work together and use it for good. It tells us that any amount of good is done for greedy and capitalistic ends, that most of the platitudes, virtues, and ideals we see purported by the superheroes are just lip service spoken by people who believe none of those things. And even if you are a good person who does believe in those things and you're trying to do the right thing in the world of the Boys, you are ultimately several steps behind the ones who will do anything to get what they want. Homelander is edgy because he's a character who not only rebels against the Superman archetype, but he is also meant to be a statement and a conclusion about the Superman archetype. Meanwhile, Omni-Man is not exactly an edgy character, and I don't think anyone would call him one. He's a father, and he's not a good person, but he's not a bad person either. We can see where he's coming from, and even if we disagree with a lot of what he's done and cannot forgive him for those things, it's also not up to us to forgive him. It's up to his family and the people that he's wronged. And any conclusion that the show does or does not make about morality and superheroes ultimately aligns with social norms and our perception of the truth, even after it depicts or acknowledges the flaws of our preconceived notions. In other words, something which is edgy is also either cynical or rebellious, whereas something which is dark is often indifferent. The suspension of disbelief is a concept which is very important to storytelling, as well as very important when it comes to the difference between something which is dark and something which is edgy. Because whenever we think about something edgy, we typically think about a scenario which is so dark and grotesque that it takes us out of our immersion. It's something so gratuitous that we almost have to laugh at it and think to ourselves, that would never happen in real life. And while most stories are enjoyed by suspending our disbelief, some stories can be enjoyed while we make fun of it and enjoy all the ludicrous scenarios that it shows to us. I think this is why, during Mason's portion of Pufferfish Studios' video, he brings up the point that something which is edgy is frequently considered bad when there are plenty of edgy stories which can be considered well written. He actually lists Berserk as an edgy story more than a dark story. And while my knee-jerk reaction to that is to say,
Actually, Berserk is a story with edgy elements because it uses these elements to blah 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 blah.
When I really think about it, though, he's kind of right. Berserk is an edgy story, not because I can't relate to Guts, or because I can't suspend my disbelief, or because the writing is bad, but because there are so many gratuitously violent and terrible things which happen in the world of Berserk that sometimes I have to get out of that immersion. The point of Berserk is to see how someone can persevere through such atrocity. Berserk makes a statement that society is too concerned with how things look when determining what is good and what is evil. Rather than looking towards the truth of good and evil, our society relies upon aesthetics. Guts is a gritty, low-born brute, where Griffith is a man of culture, intelligence, and poise. Guts is a direct rebellion of the black swordsman archetype, which is often meant to represent an evil rogue in classic fantasy. Meanwhile, Griffith is also a rebellion of the white knight archetype. Griffith is somebody who creates a perfect utopia where everyone can be happy and taken care of, but that's just the aesthetics of it. We know that, as the audience, deep down, Guts is a good person who will do the right thing even if it's not the best thing for him. Meanwhile, Griffith will stop at absolutely nothing and spare no one if it means getting what he wants. Even if what he wants is technically a good thing, he's willing to commit the worst atrocities imaginable to achieve them. Griffith has made a perfect utopia, but the world itself has turned into an unknowable hellscape filled with demons and unimaginable suffering. Anything beyond his walls is fodder, and yet he was the one who created that situation in the first place. However, Berserk is not edgy because it makes a solid statement on these things. It's edgy because it rebels against the idea of a protagonist who needs to be a good and perfect person from a noble background who does things for laudable reasons. Guts is not a bright knight fighting a dark lord. He is a dark knight fighting a bright lord. No one, outside of the people who know Guts personally, thinks that Guts is a good guy in the story, and yet he is going to do the right thing regardless. He's going to persevere no matter what collective society thinks about it. The world of Berserk is cynical. Anyone who is good is killed or worse. Anyone who's evil is given everything they desire and more. It is a world which is unfair, which posits that good is always on the back foot. It is always struggling to fight back and survive. It is the candle flame in a sea of darkness. While Berserk may resonate with us and force us to ponder or introspect, it is only after introducing shocking imagery that we begin to do that. The thoughts and emotions of Berserk's characters are not often articulated, and the gorgeous imagery of Berserk is one of the greatest selling points it has. We feel Guts' rage before it's articulated to us. Berserk's themes and story are experienced on a visceral level. And if we happen to disagree with Berserk's depiction of the human condition, we might dismiss it as edgy in a bad way. But that's not to say that there are not dark elements in Berserk, or that we are always engaging with it emotionally first, or that Berserk is always making rebellious conclusions about our world and our society through its story. Some stories have elements of both, and I think that's the reason Guts is one of the most misunderstood and difficult to replicate character archetypes in fiction. Most of what we enjoy about Guts is the imagery of a black swordsman striking back against an unfair world, a renegade who cleaves through enemies and bends his will to nothing. And then we get characters like Kirito out of it. But the deeper you look into Guts' character and understand the story of Berserk, the more we come to understand him as a person. Beyond those cathartic moments of peak edginess are the moments of contemplation and silent introspection. The ones where not a single line of dialogue is spoken, but where we can understand Guts all the same. And when those things are spoken first, that is when we are truly introduced to the dark elements of Berserk's story. Most of us tend to enjoy edgy things because it can either make us laugh or make us feel cool in an ironic way. Because something which is edgy is also something which is experienced more on an instinctive level than something which is dark. Sure, none of us can actually relate to Guts' situation, at least I hope we can't, but we can all empathize with the way that he feels. We can feel cool watching him rip people to shreds in a fit of rage. We are not the ones who persevere when reading Berserk. We are the ones reading to see if guts can persevere. Logic dictates that if we are sane people, we should be sad, disturbed, or distressed when we see a baby's head crushed by a rock. But if we see a demon building a wall out of babies in the game Agony, we can almost laugh at how absurd it is. That's emotion over logic. We are faced with such a gratuitous scenario that the only way we can actually engage with it is emotion first. The most important thing to know about edgy writing, however, is that you need to write it with confidence. Nothing is worse than an edgy story which is all edge and no substance. Ari Ferretta is a great example of this. The guy falls down into a dungeon where he's got to slurp up the pain juice until he's got white hair and enough firepower in the big iron on his hip to blast a hole in a dragon's neck. There are moments of brevity in the show, but none of them are compelling nor interesting. It makes a statement about how the weak are written off and left behind when things get difficult, but it's a statement which is made with such insecurity and cynicism that even after our character becomes strong, he is still denied by society as a whole just so we can see him take revenge on it. It's edginess for the sake of it, and typically that means that a person's edginess is neither properly earned nor maintained. If you were to put Batman, entertain this for a bit. If you were to put Batman's character into the world of Dragon Ball Z and try to write them in the exact same way, I think his character would very quickly become annoying and edgy in people's eyes. Maybe even comedic or satirical. Why? Because the dude can literally just wish his parents back to life with the Dragon Balls. The world of Dragon Ball is a pretty nice place, all things considered, and there's not really a reason to be dark or edgy at all in it. Any moments of darkness or edge are fleeting because death lacks permanence. Unless you're an android without a soul, of course. And we see that happening in the Lego movies where Batman plays a part as a character. He's more of a satirical, comedic version of himself than he is an actual depiction of Batman. Because another element to edginess is the idea that society, or the world around you, has failed you in some way. An edgy character goes against social norms and expectations. They are the rebels against the establishment. We might cheer for the edgy character, but we will very rarely emulate their behavior. The edgy character is the destructive force we all want to be when things don't go our way. They are the ones who lash out when it's more socially acceptable to be calm or obedient. They're the ones who act out our critiques of characters and stories which try to teach us morals and condescend to us about what's good in the world. I also think this can help explain why certain things which were written in the past can be considered dark, whereas if the same story was written today, they would probably be written off as edgy. Because while dark things will often fall in line with the social norms and expectations, that's not to say that social norms and expectations stay the same. Sometimes rebelling against norms can fall in and out of fashion. What might be rebellious for one generation can either be completely normal or just cringeworthy for another, depending on what people associate it with. Sometimes something which was considered to be completely normal back in the day can end up rebellious in comparison to today's standards. However, edgy is a cynical statement against normality just the same. Edgy is asking, what if you could shoot Pokemon with guns? Edgy is when Superman abuses his absolute power because that's what most people would do.
Go over there, pull out Adrian's cock, and blow him.
Edgy is saying, oh, you think Grand Theft Auto is bad? Check this out. So how can we use dark and edgy for our writing? And how can we use them with intent? How can we build audience expectations and deliver on it as writers? Here are a few tips. The first thing is that something which is considered dark by most people is something which often has substance or variety in its tones. You cannot depict a dark world without a little bit of light and hope sewn in every now and then. A comedic relief, a light at the end of the tunnel, or a good person who makes it out alive in the end. A dark story is something which unveils a harsh truth about current norms, society, or the human condition, and accepts the concept without being cynical about it. That is to say, that most of the dark situations your story depicts must also be contrasted by moments of light, levity, and indifference. A dark story is often more of a depiction than a critique or a satire. take the pressure away from your audience to agree with you on your personal conclusions, and use those moments of happiness to provide people a palate cleanse before violently waterboarding them in the blood of their favorite character. In other words, a dark story is one which manages to keep things just dark enough to be relatable, but not dark enough that it takes your audience out of their suspended disbelief, or comes off as if you are trying to prove a point to them. A dark story must align with the social norms and expectations of the audience in some way, but it can also acknowledge its shortcomings. A dark story is something which draws you deeper and forces the audience to fully experience those negative emotions and existential crises. Crisi people? Anyways, the dark elements of a story are ones which allow people to make their own conclusions about the content, rather than providing answers for them. Meanwhile, something which is edgy should have an element of rebellion or cynicism to it. It is something meant to challenge the audience or a preconception. It is meant to go against the expectation or exceed the expectation of the audience. It's also meant to provoke us on an emotional level and offer us some sort of critique, conclusion, or statement about our society, social norms, collective morality, and expectations for one another. If the audience expects angels to be good and holy, make them evil and demented. If it's the norm to not kill bad guys and just put them in jail or turn them into the police, then make a character who won't let those crooks off as easy and cleans up the streets with blood and lead. In a society where everyone is expected to fulfill their role and serve the collective, even at the cost of their individual freedoms, then make a character who is independent, self-serving, and has all the power to upend that collective responsibility. Dark is law and reality. Edgy is chaos and fantasy. This is how we can distinguish the two. Darkness is indifferent to the things that it depicts. Edginess has something to say about the things that it depicts. But here on the edge of reality, contemplating our dark fantasies, we can never truly separate the two until we learn to put thought to paper and start writing.